All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we have Dr. Warren Menzel, Professor of Mental Health at Curtin University, and his research group investigates perceptual control theory utilizing computational methods, along with its application onto psychotherapeutic interventions. And we have him here today.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for asking me. It's a real privilege to talk to such an international group and to bridge from myself, a psychologist, through to psychiatry and obviously computational approaches. As I say, my background is clinical psychology and cognitive behavior therapy. And I came across perceptual control theory really in an attempt to find a theoretical framework that would bridge the divide between the biological, the psychological and the social, and also between the different therapeutic approaches, psychodynamic, humanistic, and the cognitive behavioral. My intention wasn't to engage in computational modeling, but as I learned more about perceptual control theory and I met collaborators with this modeling and mathematical ability, it allowed us to actually push forward this work into this field. But as you see, this stretches much more into psychology than into neuroanatomy and neural networks, etc. I'm going to start by claiming a universal and transdiagnostic approach to psychiatry, and I think that's an important starting point. I won't go on too much, but I've got a few key papers. Then I'm going to try and strip right back to try and understand what behavior is, and I believe that we need to redefine behavior in order to get computational psychiatry correct. That's the entry point for perceptual control theory and its core methodology, which is to test for the controlled variable. And then in this first part, I'll be sharing with you some simple, relatively simple computational models of sense and motor performance using PCT and of a temperamental process control of information gain rate, which may be behind curiosity and exploration, which is some preliminary work that we're doing. And then in part two, I'm going to share with you the other components of PCT, which really lend themselves to a more, biopsychosocial, more integrated framework, mental architecture for understanding mental health recovery, and share with you some of the computational models that I've been involved with exploring this. And then at the end, some work that we're doing right now, going right from the lived experience of mental health recovery through to a computational model for personalized interventions. All through this, I'm going to be pointing to both huge strengths of these models and really clear limitations. And I think that is the nature of modeling, but it is also the nature of my work trying to answer different questions. Okay, so let's take a step back and take a critical look at psychiatric diagnoses. I think there is a real clear ground emerging between just taking the DSM-5 as is read and some kind of very anti-psychiatry approach that ignores some of the categorizations that we see in nature. And I think this is classically shown by a study published this year where they analyzed the self-reported symptoms of 14,000 mixed patients, presented the symptoms in a mixed order, and then used a bottom-up cluster analysis to identify the diagnoses rather than any kind of expert consensus as we're used to with DSM. And what this group find is that there are homogeneous disorders and there are heterogeneous disorders. So some of the disorders that are there in the diagnostic groups have some validity. They're relatively homogeneous, like like agoraphobia and other anxiety disorders, like the eating disorders, seem to cluster in this bottom-up way. But there are other disorders, often the most profound, like autism, PTSD, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder, that are highly heterogeneous and bring together clusters from all across these different ranges of symptom groups. So we're not in a position where we can simply take these models and actually, when you look at some of the core dimensions, internalizing, externalizing, they are highly transdiagnostic. This is even the case when we look at neurodevelopmental profiles. And again, this is a paper published this year, bottom-up analysis of 500 or so children brought into a clinic, given behavioral tests and cognitive tests, and then a cluster analysis to identify what their difficulties were. There were clear clusters that came out of these tests. So the tests were valid, but those profiles did not correspond with their diagnoses of ADHD, autism, or dyslexia. It did not map onto any specific cluster. So we are in this position where we have psychiatric and neurodevelopmental problems that have a structure, but the structure is not the one that we're given by our diagnostic systems. And that's led to a huge push in the last 20 years or so. There's now 10,000 papers published every year on transdiagnostic approaches to mental health. And in again, paper published this year, meta-analysis of 56 studies of transdiagnostic psychological therapies, it's shown that transdiagnostic therapy is superior to waiting list and treatment as usual for anxiety and depression, severe to active treatment controls for depression, so that's disorder-specific treatments for depression, and comparable effects right up to 12 months follow-up. So we are in a situation for the research where the transdiagnostic approach is at least as valid as the diagnostic approach we're used to. And so, this is what I was involved with 20 years ago, but this means that it greatly simplifies my work because I can focus on these universal mechanisms and these universal theories. So that's one way of deconstructing things. The other way is to actually go in and challenge psychology and to ask ourselves whether we really understand what behavior is. It's interesting when you look at definitions of behavior, they actually veer onto a particular school of thought, the behaviorist school of thought. This is a general Oxford English definition of behavior, the way in which an animal person behaves, bit of a tautology there, in response to a particular situation or stimulus. So we have behavior defined in these examples as a response to a stimulus. Is this really what a behavior is? This is the established model. This is how I've simplified this to some degree, but the idea is we have a stimulus from the environment that goes through some form of processing and potential mediating variables. I've got in these grey boxes the potential for top-down influences, but ultimately we've got this linear process going from stimulus to response. Okay. Is this the way that behavior works? Just think of a simple behavior. Think of a behavior like opening a car door. What is opening a car door? Is it pulling the handle? The problem is it can't be pulling the handle because sometimes you pull the handle and the door's locked. Or sometimes you have to pull with more force than another time, depending on the car and the angle that it's at. So the behavior isn't as simple as pulling the handle. So therefore, is the behavior maybe what the intended outcome is opening a car door about the door getting into an open state? That you could argue that's the case, but what happens if someone opens the door for you? You've not elicited that behavior. These things don't happen on their own. Some organism is doing the opening. So behavior really surely should be defined as a dynamic interaction between the body and the environment, rather than a simple linear output, because in these simple examples, that output is changing dynamically in order to achieve a goal. So what I'd like you to do to see how we analyze behavior and how we understand behavior is watch the video shortly. The person on the right is myself. The person on the left is a volunteer. I've given the person on the left an instruction, okay? I've told them what to do, okay? You can see their behavior because they can leave a mark on the page because they've got a green pen. I've got a blue pen. So it should be straightforward to work out what I told them to do. So can everyone see this video working? Yeah. Okay. Said I wouldn't have questions in the middle, but does anybody want to unmute themselves and say what they think the behavior was? What did I tell the person on the left to do?
Mimic what you were doing with opposite force.
Okay, great. Okay, so mimic what I'm doing or sometimes doing the opposite is another answer. Very common answers to this challenge, that it was to mimic what I was doing or do the opposite of what I was doing. That is what happened, but it wasn't what I told the person to do, unfortunately, but thanks for the guess. I have one more guess if anyone's got one.
Keep
Bearing
the
in mind-
knot on top of the point.
Say again, Lingbo?
Maybe keeping the knot on top of the point.
Brilliant. You have hit upon it. Okay, I'm going to show you the video again. Start. What I told the person on left to do is to keep the knot of the rubber band on top of the dot. Okay. Oh, I like your reaction, Yael. That's great. So you can see that the dot rarely deviates from the knot, because as soon as I pull in one direction, they do the opposite. So you were right, they are doing the opposite from me, but doing the opposite from me is the means to an end. It's not actually what I told them to do. Okay, even though you could see that behavior. Apologies for that image now. Actually, I'll kind of put it halfway and pause it, probably better. So it's interesting, isn't it, that we've got this observable record of what the behavior is. We can see that. We can see the drawing. Some people say that the task was to draw a picture of two kangaroos boxing, because they can see two kangaroos boxing, okay? But the behavior is not always what the observer sees, okay? The behavior here was to keep the knot over the dot. And I'll talk about this later, but essentially PCT is about understanding human psychology and animal psychology as keeping knots over dots. Okay, and we organize our whole nervous system around perceived locations of knots and dots. So for some people, the knot and the dot might be another distance. It might be the distance they stand from someone when they're talking to them. It might be their tone of voice. It might be, if you're having a drink, you might be keeping it so you don't spill the drink and you're on a boat or something, so you have to keep on adjusting to keep it stable. We have these various different knots over dots. It might be a high level knot over dot, like I want to be understood, so I'm going to try and talk in a way that I think might close that gap between how well I want to be understood and my sense of how well I'm being understood. Very interestingly, you can see other things we're familiar with observed from this. So if I were to pull very quickly on that rubber band, you'd see a quick response in the other direction. Okay, maybe with a quarter of a second delay. So it would look like I was providing a stimulus and they were providing a response. But that stimulus response process is an artifact of the time scale of the disturbance that I'm providing. Because I'm providing a big disturbance very quickly, it looks like a stimulus response. But if you provide a disturbance that's slower and smoother, you get this dynamic control of the disturbance. But the idea is the same, that when someone reacts to a stimulus, they're keeping a knot over the dot. So someone who startles is trying to keep their ambient volume quiet rather than loud, okay? And you also see things like the extinction burst, which is if someone has a goal and you take away the means or you put an obstacle in the way, they up the ante and they pull harder against that goal to try and get what they want. Okay, so this is the basics from which PCT starts. We've got two papers where we published this. it's actually very common for people to see these behaviors, see the kind of results of the behaviors, rather than actually what the person was doing, what the instructions were that they were given. So it's very common for us to think that the behavior is what we see, rather than the perception that the person is controlling. We've replicated this several times. And this is the roots of perceptual control theory, the idea that behavior is the control of perception. The first paper was published in 1960 by Bill Powers and two psychologists. Bill Powers was a control engineer and a medical physicist. He built electrical devices and mechanical devices such as tracking devices for telescopes, beams for radioisotopes in medicine. But his mother actually was a psychiatric nurse and used to take him to inpatient wards occasionally as a teenager and to witness some of what her work was involved. And the young William at the time was perplexed by the mental states that he saw the patients on the wards, and he just wanted to try and understand this. So a little bit later, after World War II, he got insights from the devices that he'd been working with and constructing over the late 40s and early 50s, and started working on a theory that could be informed by these ideas. At the same time, as some of you might be aware of the cybernetic movement, and there are some similarities, but also some critical differences. So this was the model that we talked about earlier. This is the PCT model, okay? So we still have an organism and an environment. We still have inputs and outputs. But now inside the organism, we have this important role of the comparator, which is constantly comparing the current state of inputs with the desired state. So that distance between the knot and the dot, and comparing it to the desired distance of 0, creating an error, which creates action, which engages some tool or aspect of the environment, like the pens and the rubber bands and the page, which is called the feedback function, to dynamically control the perceptual input. So that person is focusing on that knot and the dot, and they're going through a closed loop to keep the knot over the dot. And there'll be disturbances, things that push them out their way. And arguably, life is a process of controlling against disturbances. If we didn't, we wouldn't get dressed in the morning, we wouldn't kind of be putting makeup on, we wouldn't be fighting those kind of aspects of our life that are going to get in the way, avoiding cars on the way to work, etc. This is the very basics of staying alive and being productive. And as you'll see in grey here, there are different levels in the system, which we'll come to later. Here's a way of illustrating the just to illustrate how dynamic a simple closed loop is, okay, with the idea looking at a person who's closing that distance between a drink and their lips. I'll just play that once more. Just to illustrate this is a constant process, okay. So we perceive, we compare, and we act to bring our experiences closer to where we want them to be. This is a simplification, but it's helpful to start this change in methodology. It tells us that behavior is typically continuous and not discrete. It tells us that variation in behavior, all that squiggling that you saw with the knot and the dot, is necessary for control. It's not error, it's not noise, it's acting against disturbances. And when we think that we're manipulating stimuli, we're often actually disturbing something that the person is trying to control. And it's just the timing factor that affects whether we call this a trigger of a response. If a person was navigating their way through virtual reality, there would be no need for triggers and responses. So I think part of this is a technological limit. What it also tells us, a bit like the knot of the dot example, is that these control perceptual variables are ideographic. And we've shown this actually when we built a computer model of the knot over the dot. Rick Markham found that there was a slight parallax error in that reference point. So the most accurate computational model was one that was deviating slightly to the left of the perspective. And that is because we think the participant is over towards the left of the image. So there's a bit of a parallax error. So we each have our own perspective of the perception we're controlling. And these are individual to ourselves. And so if this is the case, if noise isn't noise, if behavior is continuous, and if we're controlling our inputs, it's going to be quite unhelpful to try and average data across multiple measurements or across participants, because what matters is what the individual is doing right now. And we've got an alternative methodology to test for the controlled variable, to test for this. And then we've got a methodology of computational modeling of the individual to model fit that data. So the test for the control variable, you hypothesize what might be controlled, the not over the dot. It needs to be something that the person can perceive and has the means to act to control. You provide disturbances to it, pull away from the not on the dot, and see if your disturbance affects that control variable. If, as in that video, the not stays over the dot, even though you pull against it, then that other agent must be acting against your disturbance. It's likely to be the controlled variable. But if it moves with it, then maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a means to an end rather than the actual control variable itself. So, for example, here's 3 different methodologies where they've done the test for control variable. A simple one, when you ask someone to control the size of a rectangle on the screen, and you just use the word size, what are they controlling? Are they controlling the perimeter or the area? And what you can do is apply disturbances to either the perimeter or the area and see whether that's kept constant. And what you find in this example is generally people control the area when they're given that instruction to keep the size constant. There's a study within ethology where Sergio Pellis and Heather Bell were hypothesizing that when a rat tries to get food from another rat, what it's controlling for is when the rat is dodging away from a rat trying to eat its food, it's controlling for keeping a large distance between the food in its mouth and the rat that's trying to seize the food from it. And again, they did these really close, detailed videos of multiple rats robbing and dodging, and found that the distance between the rats' mouths was kept constant, despite all the different other variables that were changing, which leads to the suggestion that the dodging rat is trying to maintain that far distance away and doing whatever it needs to do, whatever maneuvers in that moment to keep far enough away so that it doesn't get the food taken from it. And then myself, I've done a study in spider phobia where we've shown that the controlled variable is keeping a safe or perceived distance away from an image of a spider on a screen, and that people who are spider-phobic have a longer distance than people who are not. So it's about reframing what we might think of as a behavior, avoidance, as a controlled perceptual variable, a defensive distance. And what this allows us to do now is testing specimens. It allows us to build computational models of an individual doing that task. So we have a theory, we build a functional model, and then we compare the model to the actual data, the full continuous data, not an average of the data, not an average across the time or across participants, but the dynamic data as it emerges. And so most classically, this has been done on tracking movements of cursors on the screen, where the researcher will build a computational model, a closed loop like the ones in the diagram, and then optimize the parameters of that model on some training data, which might be the gain, which is essentially the error sensitivity, how much output per unit error, and then test the fit of that model against data that's collected later that wasn't used in the training. And so here's an example where we have in green, the participants' movements, and blue, the model's movements. You can see how closely they can map when they're an accurate closed loop model of the task. Both of them keeping the cursor in that black line close to the target point. And then you can compute the root mean squared error, the difference between the two traces, as your index of model fit. Most of the studies actually that have been published on this have used simple correlations that show very high correlations between the model and the data collected with real participants. And so myself and Max Parker, a PhD student, reviewed this literature, but also clear that these studies had small sample sizes and there was limited sort of model validation, limited tests for individual specificity, and they used correlations rather than model fit. So what Max did was try and extend this, again with a simple tracking task, but recruited 20 participants, trained them on runs, and then tested on some new unseen runs. Optimized those models for all these parameters. And we hypothesized not only would we find a good model fit generally of these closed loop models we're tracking, but that we'll find consistent differences between participants and that they will be specific to the individual model. So Max found a really low error rates between these models and the data. And there were different ways to look at the individual consistency. One was to show that there was a main effect of participant, but not of session, to show that the participants differed in these parameters. There was also high intra-class correlations, indicating that there was consistency in the individual parameters over time. And we also did another test where we compared the model fit from a model that was trained on a participant's own data with a model that was trained on someone else's data to see whether the model fit for one's own trained data was of a higher fit index than that trained by someone else. And this is a way of illustrating this. I hope it illustrates each of these graphs is a different parameter in the model. And you can see through the error bars that there's a real nice spread of these, but actually quite, for many of the parameters, quite a low margin of error within the individual. So we can see that kind of distinctiveness, which I think is quite exciting, of these different parameters across different participants. And that kind of leads us into some research that's got a closer connection with psychiatry. Also, not quite yet. Sorry. Before that, I just want to share the fact that there's a step first where we can look at tracking in a more ecological way. And the most classic example of tracking that's being researched is catching balls or fielders moving around to be in a position to catch a fly ball. And here you have a PCT model that is just controlling its perception. It's controlling two variables, one which is its lateral displacement from the image of the ball as it perceives it, and the other variable is actually the velocity, the visual velocity of the image of the ball on the retina of the computational model. So these models have no predictive ability, they have no physics modeling. All they're trying to do is replicate and control two perceptual variables which are proposed to be critical for a fielder getting in the right position to catch the ball. And when they run in this way, they always get in the right position to catch the ball, even though on every trial their behavior is different, as you can see in the bottom right. And that's because they're constantly adjusting that behavior dynamically to keep central and to keep the visual velocity constant. That actually gets the agent into the right position to catch it. So we have this ecological validity of tracking. what we're planning to do is look at another a sort of single dimension that an individual might be controlling, but we're looking at this for a factor that has more relevance for personality and learning and potentially psychiatry. And this is control of information gain rate, the amount of new and novel information we take in per minute, per second, per unit time. There's a long established interest in this, and it's been called, for example, by Skinner, called it stimulus hunger. McReynolds called it innovation rate. There are sensation seeking, novelty seeking as personality dimensions. There are whole books on cognitive motivation. And there's been allusions throughout the literature that people who end up with a diagnosis, for example, of ADHD, may have a certain optimal level of taking in novel information that's different from other people, or from at least other kids in the class in some of these contexts. And so the idea here, and this was revived very recently in another review paper, is that we all have this optimal, what they call level of stimulation. If it's too high, it's too stimulating. If it's too low, it's too boring. And so we have this rate at which we're taking in novel information. Now, I think this is actually closely tied to the bandwidth and the novelty of chunks of information that we take in within working memory, within our kind of conscious processing. But in order to test this, I think we need a methodology where the individual can control their exploration of input. And the input has to be quite immersive in order for us to be able to measure this. And so that's why Mike Landman and colleagues at Curtin University, so Mike's my PhD student, we've designed this all-immersing sphere that the person sits in within VR, and the sphere, as I hope you can see from this image, varies in the complexity of the perceptual information that it's providing. We're still working on this to make the kind of extreme end as kind of stimulating as we can, but the idea is that we immerse people in this and ask them to explore it at their own pace. We've done quite a lot of qualitative research in this already, and people do find their preferred point on this within this sphere. And so what we need to do now is to see if this is a reliable and consistent parameter for individuals, their information gain rate, and then if we see if we can link that to certain aspects of their temperament. And this links also to a model of consciousness that I published this year in Psychological Review. Okay, so part two now. Part two gets a little bit more complicated. It's where we recognize that those simple control units, there's actually thousands of them in our nervous system. They're organized in a hierarchy, a branching hierarchy, like this bottom left diagram, where the connections within a PCT hierarchy are quite specific. The outputs of a unit set the reference points for the unit below. That compares it to the inputs coming in to create an error, to drive outputs, and they go to level below that. So you get this cascading system going downwards at the same time as you have an afferent system sending signals inwards dynamically to maintain control at multiple levels. And Bill Powers actually specified these levels. There started to be 6 levels in the first incarnation of this, but for the last couple of decades, he's settled on 11 levels of perception. So, i.e., within our nervous system, we control very different types of perception at different levels, and that we manage complex skills by organizing and adjusting variables at multiple levels. Now, I'm not going to go through this in huge amount of detail, but what's clear in this, I hope, is that the low levels are concrete and relatively simple and have a relatively short time frame for control, like intensity. and sensations. But as we go up in this hierarchy, we get to controlled variables that develop more over time and depend on enactment of the levels below. So, for example, sequences depend on categories of relationships between events, for example. So in Bill Powell's work, he specified these levels. They're not written in stone, but they are a good rubric for trying to understand how and why we have a hierarchical nervous system. Another element of PCT is memory. So again, the simple control unit is a bit of an oversimplification. What Bill Powell's also specified is that we can have reentrant loops within these closed loops, right back in a 1960 paper. What this means is that we can short circuit the lower levels so that the reference point for our desired perception can be internally perceived without necessarily externally finding that object. So I can imagine a cat without going out finding a cat, okay? This allows us imagination, it allows us passive observation without control, but it also allows us both functional and dysfunctional forms of dissociation, either horizontally or vertically within this hierarchical system. Again, not going to go into that in detail now because we've not done computation on it, but there's a book chapter that spells this out that I wrote a few years ago. And then we have another principle that emerges from organizing all these control units in a big hierarchy, and that's conflict. This is when one part of the system is fighting with another part of the system, essentially having conflicting goals for the same perceptual variable. This can be part of everyday life, deciding what car to buy, being indecisive, being uncertain about what one wants. But arguably, it's critical when people are stuck with psychiatric problems. So people who want to be as far away as possible from things that scare them, but at the same time, they know they need to get closer in order to get back on that train, to have that job interview, to face that spider on the campsite, etc. And we can apply that concept to things like the vividness of a memory in trauma. Most people want to remove a vivid negative traumatic event. But what about if your sense of justice depends on you being able to recall and describe that event in detail in a court? Now you need to have the vividness to be high when you've been previously trying to make it as obliterated as possible. And I've done a lot of work in bipolar disorder, again, where you see this huge conflict where people see their high moods as a way of achieving success and overcoming their depression, at the same time as being terrified of these high moods because they're going to have another relapse and make a fool of themselves or end up in hospital. And arguably, you can't solve a conflict just by going from one side or the other. You can't give advice or tell someone to do that. High moods are all great, just forget about your problems. What you have to do is explore both of these goals and keep your awareness on those so that a higher level system can somehow regulate and configure at a sort of more of a meta level these conflicted systems. So it's that point, I think, where a person who's had a chronic phobia realizes that facing a fear isn't about not being afraid. It's about feeling the fear and doing it anyway, being brave. They get a kind of abstract concept of what that means, such that it allows them to both face their fear and sort of step away from it and regulate that for themselves. And so how does that happen when, it sounds a bit magic that you could just go up to a higher level and solve goal conflicts. It's not. It's actually quite a painstaking process according to PCT, and it's called reorganization. Reorganization is quite akin to a genetic algorithm and natural selection. The idea is that when the brain senses chronic error, it creates variation. It allows this entropy to emerge such that the parameters dynamically change. And what this means is that just like when we optimize a computational model, it explores new areas and tries new connections. But in order for that to work effectively, and apologies for this video not loading, in order for this to work effectively, the reorganization needs to be focused on a point where it's going to make a difference to the problem at hand. There's no need to change your religion to learn to tie your shoelaces. To learn to tie your shoelaces, you have to have your conscious awareness on your shoelaces. Okay. And this means that we don't rewrite our entire autobiographical memory as soon as we get a problem. We actually have a very tight focus on what's changing at any one point. And the argument according to PCT is conscious awareness is this window on what parameters are allowed to reorganize in our control systems. And as humans, we can have some control over that window. We can shift it and sustain it to certain places in the hierarchy. Unfortunately, I can't show you this model, but it shows reorganization happening in a computational model. In a trial and error way, getting to the parameters, just as you would do in a system identification research in computational modeling. But it's doing it as the system is working. Okay. Trying to advance my slides here. Okay. So how does this all come together? I think I've alluded to this. When we have unresolved goal conflict, we are in these unstable states where we can't control our moods, maybe our eating because of our conflicted goals around them. We need to go above a level to make that change at this meta level. Reorganization has to happen. So what we need to do is focus our reorganization on those. And what we find clinically is that the person has to be able to widen their awareness so that they notice other percepts, which have historically been called fringe perceptions. And that's not too far away from prepotent stimuli within neuropsychology. So the idea is that effective interventions allow people to shift and focus their awareness where it's going to make a difference for the problem and notice these emergent fringe perceptions as they happen and allow this mental and emotional and somatic content to come and go in their mental arena, if you like, to allow change. So there's a certain metacognitive skill in order to allow reorganization to resolve chronic goal conflict. It's not a skill that we need too much for everyday conflict. And interestingly, just talking about problems and sharing problems or writing them down is the first step towards resolving conflict. But for chronic problems, there needs to be sort of more time and more detail placed on that process. We developed a self-report scale to try and tap into this mindset, which we call the reorganization of conflict scale. Items like, I find that it helps to weigh up the pros and cons of different things I could do to solve a problem. I feel that it helps to take a step back and look at my problems from a different perspective. That's kind of this kind of allowing of a mental arena of coming and goings of one's own impulses and images and thoughts, etc. In these questionnaire studies, we found that it increases. People get better at this after successful therapy. So in summary, I'm sharing with you a new conceptualization of behavior, a transdiagnostic approach, new research methods, some examples of computational modeling, and some of our latest work trying to bring that into the lived experience of mental health recovery. So thank you, and questions welcome.
Awesome. Okay. Andrew has a question.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. So I'm curious about a few things, well, a bunch of things actually. You got me thinking. One question though was about this point you made in passing about the necessity of variability in behavior, and I think there's kind of two key ways to think about that. One is that for us as researchers to infer something about PCT playing a role here, we need to see that variability, right? To model, you need variability. But there's another, which is the person, in order to successfully be a PCT agent, they need variability to learn from the pursuit of goals. They need errors, for example. So I just was curious to know which sense you meant, or if there was a third sense I'm missing. And
Yeah, I mean, there's at least two senses. So there's the variability in the action as we kind of measure it, the sort of the force that's going through the muscles at that one moment in one direction or the other. That needs to vary on the fly in fractions of a second to counteract disturbances, like when you're balancing a peacock feather. Okay, that's one type of variation. But there's also a longer term variation, which is the variation in the parameters of those control systems that utilize that dynamic behavior. And so the idea is that the gains and the perceptual functions are also changing at a certain rate in a certain direction. They're getting more or less sensitive. And reorganization, when we are driven intrinsically to learn, will push those changes further in a new direction for us to reorganize at that neural level, not our behavior, but the control systems that are responsible for using our behavior to control perception. So there's two different meanings of variation in there.
Isabel?
Yeah, thanks. Very nice. I should say, I think I came across your work a few years ago, and it was the first time that I saw sort of an engineering computational approach to psychotherapy, which was really nice to see then. I have a few questions. I'll start with one. So you haven't used the word homeostasis in the entire
I
talk.
often do. Yeah.
And I wonder sort of what you see, the mapping between that, where you really would see, is there a difference between what you're talking about versus, for example, homeostatic RL? And would there be different predictions, etc.? Because I feel like control theory is a lot about maintaining homeostasis, which is, also another line people think about.
Yeah, so I like to think of PCT as homeostasis, but instead of it being an internal milieu, it's about the actions going through the outside environment back in through the senses. But it's exactly the same process as homeostasis in that it's correcting for set points, but it's not doing it through hormones in the bloodstream or within a cell. It's doing it through the signal in the behavior via the environment that's necessary and the perception of the changes that are made from that manipulation of the environment in this sort of closed loop. So the brain is kind of a stack of homeostats. What deviates from our work and say that of predictive coding or free energy is that because we consider these homeostats as these nested hierarchies with different timescales of input, we don't necessarily see prediction happening unless the environment is kind of choreographed in that way. So most of the time, when you're free living, you can control those perceptions over different timescales, and you can preempt these changes, and that's all part of control. Now, we might sometimes call that prediction, and sometimes predictions evolve, sometimes it isn't. But essentially, we share that root of homeostasis with a lot of the other popular models that are used in neuroscience. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. I mean, there is another element, which is that the biological homeostatic systems, which in PCT are called the intrinsic systems, are separate from the perceptual control systems. And it's these intrinsic systems that provide the learning signal for the perceptual control systems. So they're kind of two separate stacks, if you like, that are orthogonal to each other, but interacting with each other. In my consciousness theory, I've also proposed, along with some others, that there's potentially a third stack, which is your kind of propositional symbolized information stack as well, which kind of need if we want to understand human consciousness. yeah, homeostasis is a great foundation for it all.
I mean, I have more questions, but I want to give other people
Hmm.
the opportunity. Somebody has a question. Well, then I'll ask one more question. So about what you talked about, sort of consciousness as a regulator and then reorganization on that level. So I think my question is, what do you think? How can we ensure these types of regulation and like making things conscious and like reorganizing lead to an enduring change? Because what I've seen in therapy is that, you know, people are able to become conscious of things, you know, gain insight, understand that, but that doesn't always hold and is enduring. So do you think there are two different situations where people do understand something, but then, you know, it doesn't hold, and, you know, how to make that conscious regulation reorganization hold?
Yeah, I mean, I think people will get insights during this process, and those insights will vary in terms of the level that they are and the type of insights they are. They probably haven't had the actual insight that they need to make it enduring. And I guess that is part of this process of going through the right material in terms of that emotional material, that material laid down in memory, that material laid down in the body. So going through that material at the same time as having the freedom to explore at a higher level so that you can actually get a sense of perspective that's more at the level of your kind of self-identity and your rules for life. So I think there's this coupling, and I think PCT is not alone in that coupling of these sort of very low-level systems and very high-level systems that need to happen in effective therapy, where we need to be in touch with the visceral sense of our everyday lives at the same time as we are noticing them from quite a high-level perspective of the social context and our social roles and our priorities. And method of levels constructed from PCT is a way to do that within a conversation with a person. And it's largely driven by the curiosity of the therapist and their capacity to notice these present moment intrusions, impulses, bodily states, to get, yes, insights, but insights that are lasting because they're much more integrated with the different parts of that person rather than kind of over here and not taking in the full system. Given that, you know, it's functional for us to dissociate. You know, we have different roles in different parts of our lives, but it's also dysfunctional to dissociate. So there's this sort of conflict, but effective therapy brings those compartmentalized parts together so that we get an overall perspective on the challenge that's confronting us. We found that actually with our journey mapping, you know, that when people see their whole lives out in front of them, and then they flip between talking about these moments of where they decided not to kill themselves because their daughter was born, and the visual intensity of that, and then they step back and they see that in their whole life history as, oh, that was pivotal to making this change in my identity. We see that in our research as well, this sort of really yeah, like, see, it's quite profound, but it's this way that regulating between the very intense somatic and personal experiences and these sort of broader perspectives can be what lasts, I think. That makes sense.
And then, Elsie.
Yes, I have one question. Warren, how we define computationally reorganization? And if we can define how it can be shown as a necessity in a computational model,
Mm.
if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's a
Um,
really important piece of
Let
work.
me interrupt for a second just before, because I noticed now the time and we didn't say that like many people have had to leave because we passed the hour mark. So so we'll continue with this question and then we'll go to kind of a more informal discussion with whoever wants to say. So after this question, we'll stop the recording. So please answer.
Cool.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I can, I get that. I can see that if we can specify the mathematics of it, we can test the necessity of it just within a computational system in and of itself. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm gonna.
Thank you so much. We can do
Yes,
it.
thank you so much.
Round of applause.
One more round of applause. All right.
Yeah. No, thanks for bringing together all these researchers.
All right.
So what we usually do now, and I don't know, what is the time for you, Warren? Is it like
Oh,